A hardworking janitor faces relentless humiliation from a pompous, racist CEO who sees him as nothing more than the help. Little does the CEO know, the janitor holds the ultimate secret. He's the majority owner of the very company the CEO thinks he runs. This powerful story unravels themes of humility, respect, and leadership as the tables turn in an unforgettable revelation that leaves the CEO stunned and viewers inspired. A tale of quiet strength, resilience, and the truth that you should never judge someone by their appearance. Daniel Carter pushed the mop across the glossy tile floor, the sound of swishing water the only company he had in the bustling corporate building. Dressed in a simple blue janitor uniform, he blended into the background, a fixture no one noticed. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and ambition as sharp-suited employees strode by without so much as a glance in his direction. Daniel didn't mind. He had grown used to being overlooked. The building itself was grand, gleaming glass walls stretched high above, casting reflections of the towering city skyline. Employees with their expensive shoes and hurried conversations exuded confidence. Daniel moved among them, unseen yet observant, his salt and pepper hair tucked neatly under a cap. At 48, he had the calm demeanor of someone who had lived through storms and come out stronger. At that moment, Richard Stone entered the lobby. His arrival was hard to miss. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the swagger of a man who thought he owned the world. His tailored suit, sharp as a blade, and slicked-back hair screamed authority. Richard glanced around the lobby, his piercing gaze scanning for flaws, not in the building, but in the people. Daniel had just finished wiping down the glass doors when Richard's voice cut through the space. "Hey, you missed a spot," he barked, pointing at an invisible speck on the floor. Daniel looked up, meeting Richard's eyes. There was no malice in his expression, only quiet patience. "Thank you, sir. I'll get right on it." Richard smirked, as if he'd proven a point. "Make sure you do. This place needs to look perfect when the investors arrive. First impressions matter." Daniel nodded and continued his work. But behind his calm exterior, something stirred. By the time the meeting started upstairs, Daniel was back in the break room, wiping his hands clean. He overheard two employees gossiping near the vending machine. "Richard's in one of his moods again," one muttered. "When isn't he?" the other replied with a laugh. Daniel smiled faintly. He'd seen men like Richard before, arrogant, overconfident, and quick to judge. But he had also learned that the loudest men often had the most to learn. As Daniel left the break room and returned to the lobby, he caught sight of Richard barking orders at a receptionist. Daniel paused for a moment, watching. The man's confidence seemed unshakable, almost unassailable. But Daniel knew something Richard didn't. The corner of his mouth turned up ever so slightly, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. This was going to be interesting. The morning rush in the lobby had slowed to a steady hum. Daniel quietly worked near the reception desk, wiping down the sleek counters and adjusting a flower vase that had tilted slightly. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. Years of practice had taught him the value of precision, no matter how small the task. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw Richard reappear. His commanding stride echoed across the marble floor, his phone glued to his ear. The tone of his conversation was sharp, filled with clipped words and half smirks, as if the person on the other end was just another problem to manage. He ended the call abruptly, shoving his phone into his pocket as his eyes landed on Daniel. A sneer crept onto his face. Richard walked toward him, his polished shoes tapping with purpose. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. Daniel straightened up, holding the rag loosely in his hand. "Yes, sir. A little over 15 years. 15 years, Richard repeated, dragging out the words as though they were hard to comprehend. "And still, just a janitor?" The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. A few employees passing by froze, their eyes darting between the two men. Some looked away, pretending they hadn't heard. Daniel didn't flinch. His face remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, a flicker of something unreadable. "It's honest work," he said evenly. "I take pride in keeping this place clean." Richard laughed, loud and derisive, his voice echoing across the lobby. "Pride? In scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans? Don't kid yourself. This isn't a job for someone with ambition." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some employees exchanged uneasy glances, but no one stepped in. Richard's reputation for being ruthless preceded him. Daniel took a deep breath, wiping his hands on the rag before slipping it into his pocket. "Everyone has a role to play," he said, his tone calm but firm. Some of us just choose to play ours with dignity. Richard's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he regained his composure. Dignity doesn't pay the bills, he shot back. You're just lucky we let you stick around here. Honestly, this place deserves better. The insult stung, not because it was true, but because it was said so casually, as though Daniel's worth could be reduced to the work he did. For the first time, a hint of frustration flickered across Daniel's face. Before he could respond, a soft voice interrupted. Excuse me, Mr. Stone. The receptionist, Claire, stood nearby, her face pale but determined. The investors have arrived, she said, her eyes darting nervously toward Daniel. Richard straightened his jacket, ignoring the tension in the air. Good. Let's show them what a first-class operation looks like. He shot one last smug glance at Daniel before turning on his heel and striding toward the elevators. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel stayed rooted to the spot, his hands resting on the counter he had just cleaned. His jaw tightened for a moment before he exhaled slowly. He knew men like Richard all too well, quick to judge, quicker to dismiss. But Daniel had long since learned that patience was more powerful than pride. With a small, determined smile, he picked up his mop and bucket and continued his work. Unseen by most, but always watching, always waiting. As Daniel stepped into his modest yet warm home, a sense of relief washed over him. Gone was the stiff uniform, replaced by a comfortable sweater and jeans. He placed his janitor's cap neatly on the counter, pausing to glance at the framed photographs on the wall. Snapshots of his family, his late brother, and memories of simpler times. To the outside world, Daniel was just another janitor. But behind closed doors, he was much more than that. Daniel had once been deeply entrenched in the corporate world. Years ago, his older brother, Michael, had founded the very company Daniel now cleaned floors for. Together, they built it from the ground up, with Michael leading the charge while Daniel managed operations behind the scenes. But after Michael's sudden passing, everything changed. Grieving and disillusioned with the cutthroat corporate culture, Daniel had stepped away, leaving the company's leadership in the hands of a board of directors. His only condition? Retaining the majority stake to safeguard his brother's legacy. But the distance hadn't sat well with Daniel. Over time, he had become increasingly concerned about the company's direction. Whispers of poor treatment of employees, a toxic environment, and a general erosion of values reached his ears. So Daniel made a decision, a bold, unconventional one. He chose to step back into the company, but not in the way anyone would expect. Under the radar, he applied for a janitorial position at one of the company's flagship branches. The anonymity offered him a unique perspective, one he couldn't get from boardroom reports. As a janitor, Daniel saw the truth of the workplace culture, unfiltered by corporate polish. But nothing had prepared him for Richard. Richard embodied everything Daniel disliked about the modern corporate world: arrogance, entitlement, and a lack of basic human decency. Daniel had witnessed Richard's behavior countless times, not just toward him, but toward other employees too. The snide comments, the dismissive tone, it all painted a clear picture of someone who valued status over substance. The scene from earlier that day played in Daniel's mind. Richard's mockery, the laughter of onlookers. It wasn't the first time Daniel had experienced something like this, but it stung more than usual. Not for himself, he had long developed thick skin, but for the principle of it. How many others had Richard humiliated? How many employees felt voiceless because they were too afraid to stand up to him? As Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his teenage daughter Maya walked in. Bright and curious, Maya was a constant source of wisdom in Daniel's life, despite her young age. "You seem quiet today, Dad," Maya said, setting down her school books. "Rough day at work?" Daniel smiled faintly. "You could say that." Maya tilted her head, studying him. "Was it that Richard guy again? You've mentioned him before." Daniel nodded. "He doesn't realize how he treats people. Or maybe he does, and just doesn't care." Maya frowned. "So why don't you do something about it? You have the power, Dad. Why let him walk all over you?" Daniel looked at his daughter, her eyes full of conviction. "Because sometimes, Maya, it's better to let people reveal their true selves first. The right moment will come." Maya folded her arms, clearly unconvinced. "I just don't understand why you're waiting. It's not fair to let someone like that get away with it. Daniel reached across the table. Daniel reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. It's not about fairness. It's about impact. When the time comes, the lesson will be far more valuable if it's one he truly learns. Later that evening, as Daniel prepared for bed, he paused to look at the old leather briefcase sitting in the corner of his room. It held documents that proved his position as the majority shareholder, contracts that bore his signature, and the legacy his brother had left behind. He hadn't touched the briefcase in months, but he knew it wouldn't stay closed much longer. Richard's behavior wasn't just a personal insult, it was a sign of a deeper issue within the company, and Daniel wouldn't let it slide any longer. He wasn't just a janitor, he was the quiet observer, the man who held the keys to the future of the company. But for now, he waited. The wheels were already in motion. The next morning, the hum of the office buzzed with activity, but Daniel moved through it unnoticed, just like always. Clipboard in hand, mop nearby, and a faint smile that masked his thoughts. He was used to blending in, observing the company's every move without drawing attention. But today would mark a shift, a nudge from the universe that his time in the shadows was coming to an end. Around midday, as Daniel tidied up a hallway near the executive offices, he heard a familiar voice. Mr. Allen, the company's board chairman, stood at the far end of the corridor, speaking with Richard. Daniel paused, pretending to inspect his supplies, but his ears perked up. Richard, Mr. Allen said, his tone heavy with disappointment. I've been hearing complaints, too many complaints, frankly. Your leadership is being questioned. Richard scoffed, his bravado unshaken. With all due respect, sir, people complain because they don't like discipline. Someone has to be tough. Mr. Allen frowned. There's a difference between tough and tyrannical. If things don't change, the board will have to intervene. The words hit Daniel like a lightning bolt. He knew Mr. Allen to be a thoughtful man, one of the few who had always respected the legacy of the company. If Mr. Allen was voicing concerns, the cracks in Richard's armor were deeper than Daniel had realized. Richard brushed off the conversation with a hollow laugh and walked away. But Mr. Allen lingered, his expression clouded with worry. Taking a chance, Daniel approached him, pushing his cart silently until they were side by side. Mr. Allen, Daniel said quietly, if I may have a word. The elderly man turned, his sharp eyes softening as he recognized Daniel. Ah, Daniel, he said with a small smile. Of course, how are you? I'm well, Daniel replied, his voice measured. But I overheard what you said to Richard. I think we both know the company can't afford his kind of leadership for much longer. Mr. Allen sighed, leaning on his cane slightly. You're right. I've been patient, but his behavior is eroding the company's reputation. Employees are unhappy. Clients are questioning us. And frankly, I don't see him changing. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then said, perhaps it's time I step in. Mr. Allen's eyes widened slightly. He had always known who Daniel really was, but respected his choice to remain under the radar. Are you certain? He asked. Once you step forward, there's no going back. Daniel nodded. I've seen enough. Richard's behavior isn't just bad leadership. It's a reflection of deeper problems in the company culture. If I wait any longer, the damage may be irreversible. Mr. Allen studied him for a moment, then smiled. It's about time. Let me know how I can support you. The two men spoke for several minutes, outlining a plan to address the board and hold Richard accountable. Daniel insisted on handling the reveal carefully. He wanted the lesson to be impactful, not vindictive. Mr. Allen agreed, promising to gather the board for a special meeting the following week. As the day went on, Daniel felt a strange mix of anticipation and resolve. He thought of Maya's words from the night before. Why let someone like Richard get away with it? She was right, and now he was ready to act. Back in the break room, Richard was basking in his usual arrogance, joking with a few junior employees about the useless janitor who always seemed to be lurking around. The guy probably thinks he owns the place, Richard laughed, earning a chorus of chuckles. Daniel passed by the door, catching Richard's words. He paused just for a moment, then continued on his way, his expression unreadable. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, Daniel reviewed the documents that solidified his position as the majority shareholder. Maya joined him, her curiosity palpable. Are you finally going to do something, Dad? She asked. Yes, Daniel said, a quiet determination in his voice. It's time. Maya grinned. Good. He has no idea what's coming. Neither did anyone else. The boardroom buzzed with quiet chatter. Executives and employees shuffled into the sleek conference room, their faces a mix of curiosity and expectation. At the head of the table, Richard stood with his trademark smug expression, adjusting his tie and clearing his throat. Thank you all for being here today, he began, his tone dripping with self-importance. I've called this meeting to announce a bold new initiative that will drive our company forward. Under my leadership, of course. Employees seated at the edges of the room exchanged uneasy glances. Richard's initiatives usually meant more pressure on them with little to show for it. Before Richard could launch into his rehearsed speech, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom creaked open. A sharp, collective intake of breath followed. Daniel entered the room. But this wasn't the quiet, uniformed janitor they all knew. Gone were the khakis and faded polo. Instead, Daniel was dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit, a silver watch glinting on his wrist. His posture was commanding, his expression calm yet focused. The room fell silent. Richard's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice barely hiding the irritation. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He walked to the head of the table with slow, deliberate steps, his presence alone shifting the energy in the room. Once he reached the center, Daniel turned to face the gathered crowd. "I'd like to thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steady yet commanding. "There's something I've been meaning to share with you." Whispers rippled through the room. Richard glanced at the other board members, searching for support. "Security!" he barked. "Someone get security in here!" But no one moved. Mr. Allen, seated near the end of the table, leaned forward and spoke calmly. "That won't be necessary, Richard." "Let him speak," Richard froze, his confidence visibly shaken. Daniel continued, addressing the room. "For years I've been part of this company, observing, listening, and learning. Most of you know me as the janitor. But that's only part of the story." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I'm Daniel Bennett, majority shareholder and co-owner of this company." The silence that followed was deafening. Eyes widened. Mouths dropped open. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Richard took a step back, his face pale. This has to be some kind of joke," he stammered. "You're lying." Daniel smiled faintly, pulling a neatly folded document from his pocket. "This," he said, placing it on the table, "is proof of my ownership. My brother founded this company years ago. When he passed, he left the majority stake to me." The document made its way around the table, board members examining it with furrowed brows. Richard's disbelief turned to panic as the truth became undeniable. "You've shown me everything I needed to see, Richard," Daniel said, his gaze locking onto the CEO. "Not just about you, but about the culture you fostered here. A culture of arrogance, disrespect, and dismissal." Richard opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. Daniel turned to the board. "Effective immediately, I'm calling for a full review of Mr. Richard Davis's leadership. His actions have jeopardized the integrity of this company and the trust of its employees." The room erupted into quiet murmurs of agreement. Mr. Allen nodded, his expression resolute. "I second this motion," he said. Richard's voice finally returned, but it was shaky. "You can't do this," he said, his bravado crumbling. "I've worked here for years. You've had plenty of time to prove yourself," Daniel interrupted. "But respect is something you never earned, Richard. And without it, leadership means nothing." As the room absorbed his words, Daniel stepped back, signaling that he was finished. The room remained still, but one thing was clear. Everything had changed. The room hung in stunned silence after Daniel's declaration. Employees whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting between him and Richard. The once confident CEO now looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "Wait," Richard finally said, his voice trembling. "You've got this all wrong, Daniel. Mr. Bennett, I didn't know who you were. If I had—" Daniel raised a hand, silencing him. "And that's the problem, Richard. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with decency." Richard's face flushed a deep crimson. He fidgeted with his tie, his carefully constructed arrogance crumbling by the second. I was Under pressure, he stammered. You know how it is running a company this size. Daniel let out a soft sigh, stepping forward. I know exactly how it is. That's why I chose to work undercover, to see how this company operates from the ground up. And do you know what I saw? Richard swallowed hard, his gaze darting toward the board members, hoping for an ally. But they sat still, their expressions unreadable. I saw hardworking employees being disrespected, Daniel continued, his tone calm but firm. I saw a culture of fear and intimidation, fostered by a leader who's more concerned with appearances than results. Richard opened his mouth to retort, but Mr. Allen spoke first. Daniel is right, the chairman said, his voice steady and authoritative. We've had complaints about your leadership for months, Richard. Your treatment of staff, your inflated ego, it's all been adding up. The weight of those words hit Richard like a blow. He slumped slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Please, he said quietly, his bravado gone. Just give me another chance. I can change. Daniel studied him for a long moment. The room was so quiet that the faint ticking of a wall clock echoed. Change doesn't happen overnight, Daniel finally said, and it doesn't start with excuses. It starts with accountability. He turned to the board. I propose we place Richard on temporary suspension while a full review of his leadership is conducted. During this time, I'll oversee the company's operations personally. There was a murmur of agreement. Mr. Allen nodded. I support this motion. Richard, you'll step down effective immediately, pending the results of the review. Richard's face twisted into a mixture of anger and desperation. You can't just replace me. I've built this company. No, Daniel interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. My brother built this company. You were given a chance to honor his vision, and you chose to serve yourself instead. With those words, the decision was final. Richard stood, his movements slow and defeated. His gaze briefly met Daniel's, but there was no malice left in his eyes, only regret. As Richard walked out of the boardroom, the tension began to lift. Employees exchanged glances, some relieved, others unsure of what came next. Daniel turned back to the room, his expression softening. This isn't just about one person. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued. That's the legacy my brother envisioned, and it's one I intend to uphold. The employees nodded, a sense of hope slowly replacing the earlier unease. After the meeting, Daniel lingered in the lobby. As the staff began to disperse, Mitch, one of the janitors, approached him cautiously. Mr. Bennett, Mitch said, his voice hesitant, I just wanted to say thank you for standing up for all of us. Daniel smiled warmly. It's not just about standing up. It's about following through. If you ever see something wrong, Mitch, don't hesitate to speak up. Change starts with all of us. Mitch nodded, a newfound confidence in his posture. As Daniel prepared to leave, Mr. Allen caught up to him. You handled that well, the chairman said, but this is just the beginning. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. I know. There's a lot of work ahead, but it's work worth doing. That evening, as the office lights dimmed, the company felt different. It wasn't just the departure of Richard. It was the promise of something better. The following morning, Daniel walked into the company's headquarters with a clear purpose. The air felt lighter, and the tension that once hung over the office like a storm cloud seemed to have dissipated. Employees whispered among themselves as he passed by, their faces a mixture of curiosity and hope. Daniel called for a meeting with the senior management team. The conference room filled quickly, and everyone sat silently, their eyes fixed on him. He stood at the head of the table, a quiet authority radiating from his presence. Let me start by saying this, Daniel began, his voice calm but resolute. This company wasn't built to thrive on fear or arrogance. It was built to create opportunities, to foster innovation, and to respect every single person who walks through these doors, employees and clients alike. Heads nodded around the room. Some managers exchanged glances, as though silently acknowledging their part in the toxic culture Richard had cultivated. We've lost sight of those values, Daniel continued, but it's not too late to change. Change starts today. He outlined his vision for the company, one centered on respect, inclusivity, and growth. His first initiative was a mentorship program designed to support entry-level employees and ensure their voices were heard. Everyone here has potential, he said. Our job as leaders is to help them realize it. The room stirred with energy. Managers began jotting down notes, their enthusiasm building. Daniel then shifted to the topic of accountability. He announced that all employees, regardless of rank, would participate in mandatory leadership and diversity training. No one is exempt, he said firmly, not even me. At that moment, the door opened and a young intern entered, carrying a tray of coffee for the team. The intern hesitated, unsure if it was the right time to interrupt. Daniel smiled and waved him in. "Thank you," he said warmly. The simple gesture didn't go unnoticed. It was a stark contrast to Richard's dismissive behavior, and it set the tone for the kind of leader Daniel intended to be. As the meeting concluded, Daniel's final words left a lasting impression. Respect isn't just a policy, it's a mindset. It's how we build trust, and trust is what will take this company forward. Let's show the world what we're capable of. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked through the office, greeting employees by name. He paused to chat with a team of junior designers, praising their work on a recent project. Their faces lit up, energized by the unexpected recognition. In the days that followed, the transformation became evident. The office buzzed with renewed purpose. Employees who once kept their heads down now felt empowered to share ideas. Teams collaborated more openly, and the walls that Richard's leadership had built between departments began to crumble. Daniel's mentorship program took off quickly. Employees signed up in droves, eager to learn and grow. Daniel personally mentored a handful of staff members, sharing insights from his years of experience. But the most surprising change came from Richard himself. As part of his suspension, he was required to participate in the mentorship program. At first, he resisted, showing up late to sessions and barely engaging, but over time, something shifted. During one session, a young marketing assistant shared her story of struggling to balance work and family responsibilities. Her vulnerability struck a chord with Richard, and he began to see the human side of the employees he once dismissed. One afternoon, Richard approached Daniel. "I didn't realize how much I had to learn," he admitted quietly. Daniel studied him for a moment before replying, "Growth isn't easy, Richard, but it's worth it." By the end of the first month, the company had already begun to shed its old reputation. Customers noticed the difference, and word spread quickly about the positive changes under Daniel's leadership. In the break room, Mitch, the janitor, watched as Daniel shared a laugh with a group of employees. He smiled, thinking about how far the company had come in such a short time. Months later, the company headquarters was unrecognizable. Not in appearance, but in atmosphere. What once felt cold and corporate now felt alive and collaborative. Employees walked the halls with confidence, their laughter echoing through spaces that had been quiet and tense for years. Daniel stood at the large glass window of his office, gazing at the bustling courtyard below. The view wasn't just one of a thriving company. It was a reflection of a culture he had painstakingly rebuilt. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," Daniel said warmly. Mitch, the janitor who had been a quiet observer through it all, stepped inside. His uniform was crisp, and his posture carried a newfound pride. "Mr. Bennett, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. This place feels different now, better." Daniel smiled. "It's not just me, Mitch. Everyone here played a part in making this change happen." He walked over, clasping Mitch's shoulder. "But I'll admit, it started with the courage to demand better." Downstairs, Richard sat in a small meeting room, helping a group of interns brainstorm for a project. His demeanor was unrecognizable. He listened intently, nodding as each intern shared their ideas. One of them, nervous but determined, asked, "Mr. Carter, what do you think?" Richard leaned forward, his tone soft but steady. "I think it's a great start. Keep pushing, though. Your potential is bigger than you think." His suspension had been a wake-up call. The mentorship program forced him to confront not just his biases, but also his insecurities. Over time, Richard transformed from an arrogant leader to a reflective team player. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and his effort hadn't gone unnoticed. The public transformation of the company didn't go unnoticed either. Media outlets celebrated the story with headlines like "Janitor turn visionary leader reshapes company culture" and "Respect and Redemption, a corporate revolution." One evening, Daniel was invited to speak at a local community center. The room was packed with young professionals, students, and local business owners eager to hear his story. Standing at the podium, Daniel took a deep breath before beginning. "Leadership isn't about titles or power," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's about the choices we make every day, choices to listen, to respect, and to empower. True leadership starts with humility." He shared the journey of his undercover role, the lessons he learned, and the transformation that followed. The audience hung on his every word, inspired by his ability to turn a negative experience into a movement for change. After his speech, a young woman approached him. Her eyes shone with determination as she said, "Your story reminded me why I wanted to start my own business, to build something where everyone feels seen and valued." "That's the kind of legacy we need," Daniel replied with a smile. Back at the office, the changes continued to ripple outward. The mentorship program became a model for other companies, and employees began volunteering in community outreach programs. The company's reputation soared, not just for its products, but for its integrity. One afternoon, Daniel walked through the office, pausing to chat with employees. As he reached the lobby, he spotted Mitch talking to a new janitor, giving him tips on how to manage the workload efficiently. Mitch noticed Daniel and waved. Daniel walked over and extended his hand. "Thanks for setting the standard, Mitch." Mitch beamed. "Just doing my part, Mr. Bennett." As Daniel turned to leave, his gaze fell on a plaque newly mounted in the lobby. It read, "A culture of respect, built by us for everyone." He smiled, knowing the message wasn't just words on a wall. It was a promise the company now lived by.